In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
Philosophy has never been afraid of tackling the really big questions. The creation of the universe could be regarded as the province of religion, and most of the world's religions have creation myths, and most believe that the universe was created by a single God. But science has given us an alternative. The Big Bang hypothesis has explained the beginnings of the universe without bringing in any supernatural being. It might seem foolhardy to try and work out the merits of religion and science. But even if philosophy cannot give a definite answer, it can help us understand the differences and similarities between the religious and scientific approaches. But is it possible to accept the science and still believe in a creator God? What are the arguments on either side, and are they any good? Are science and religion fundamentally incompatible?
It does depend what kind of religious belief you're into, I think. If you're one of the people who have to take the Bible literally, then I think, yes, you've got considerable trouble. If you're prepared to take that sort of thing more figuratively, then it gets easier. And if you're not too bound to traditional faith as interpreted centuries ago, then it gets easier still.
The Big Bang theory argues that at the beginning of time, everything in the universe was squashed together, and out of a single explosion, the entire universe and all the laws of physics, space, time itself, and all the conditions necessary for life were created. Not all scientists believe that the Big Bang theory is incompatible with a belief in God. Indeed, some scientists believe that the very nature of the universe actually supports the idea of a God. The laws of physics had to be so finely tuned in order to produce life that it's inconceivable that in the chaos of Big Bang this could have happened by chance.
Suppose one was given the task of designing a universe for oneself, an imaginary universe which was going to be suitable for life. How would it turn out? Well, if it began with a Big Bang like this universe did, your first decision is how violent to make the Big Bang. Now, if you make the violence a little bit less than it actually was, you think there's overdoing things a bit, so let's turn the wick down. What happens then is that all the gas comes out and it slows down because of mutual gravity between all the parts of the universe, comes to a halt, and then everything comes crashing back together in what we call a big crunch. And that will happen in a time less than 12,000 million years, which is how long it's taken for us to put in our appearance. So if you turn the wick down, you get no life. So you may say, well, okay, in that case, I'll err on the other side. For safety, I will make my Big Bang a little bit more violent. Now what happens is that the gas comes out, and instead of inhomogeneities forming, all the gas just disperses because it comes out too fast. In which case, without any stars, you're not going to get life. Now, it turns out that the window of opportunity is incredibly narrow. It's very easy to have your violence too small or too great. In either case, no life. This particular universe hits it absolutely on the button in between those two extremes, which is very strange. Now that is the first coincidence. You've got to get your Big Bang absolutely right in its violence. You then got to think, well, how am I going to build the stuff of bodies? Because out of that violent Big Bang, all you get are the two lightest gases, hydrogen and helium. So in your imaginary universe, you've got to be very careful to make sure that you get stars. So, for example, when you're thinking about how strong to make your gravity, you might initially decide, well, I'll make gravity less strong. Be careful, because now you'll only collect a small amount of gas. It will not raise the temperature sufficient to ignite the nuclear fires. You get no stars and no life. You may say, oh, in that case, I'll veer on the other side. I will make my gravity stronger than it actually is. Well, now you collect so much gas together, the temperature rises so much that when the nuclear fusion processes are triggered, they go off so fast that the star burns out in no time at all. Well, in 1 million years, which on this scale is no time at all. And so, again, no life. So you must get your gravitational force exactly right. And again, this universe does that. Another strange coincidence. And I could go on. There's a whole list of, well, what do you call them? Coincidences. All necessary in order for there to be life.
Professor Stannard is putting forward a version of the argument from design. This was made famous in the 18th century by the philosopher William Paley. The argument from design is one of the classical philosophical proofs for the existence of God. Paley argued that if you happened upon a mechanical and intricate object like a watch, then you'd automatically assume that there was a watchmaker. So, by analogy, if you consider the intricate nature of the world, then you should look for a divine watchmaker.
William Paley was famously impressed with the eye, indeed virtually all other bits of the body, but the eye was the one he dealt with first in his book, and so that's one that's often been a favourite since. It is obviously very complicated. It does a beautiful job. It has a lens which has variable focus. It has an iris diaphragm which opens and closes to let in different amount of light depending upon how much light there is coming in. It has an exceedingly sophisticated retina, which is a sheet of millions of light-sensitive cells, each one connected up via a sophisticated set of interconnections with the brain. So this is a very, very complicated piece of apparent design, and it's no wonder that before Darwin came along and explained it, people thought they had to resort to a divine creator.
Darwin's theory of natural selection argued that species evolve step by step, and only successful species last long enough to pass their genes on to further generations. But what exactly is going on here? We need to look at the structure of the arguments to find out what's being asserted and what's being denied. A logically watertight form of argument is the deductive argument. Let's take a simple example. Premise 1, Max is a cat. Premise 2, all cats have 4 legs. The conclusion which must follow is that Max has 4 legs. But the argument from design is a different form of argument. It's an inductive argument. Inductive arguments start with evidence from observation from which they infer a likely conclusion. So let's take the argument from design stage by stage. The first premise is that living organisms are ordered in such a way as to be perfectly adapted to their environment. The second premise is that available evidence suggests that where there is order, something or someone consciously imposed this order. Therefore, the likely conclusion is that God imposed this order. Darwin's theory of evolution denied the second of the two premises. That is, evolution provides an alternative explanation of how order was created. But that doesn't mean that all inductive arguments are no good. Scientists, philosophers, and all of us use this kind of argument all the time. Let's go back to the modern argument from design, which looks for explanations of the beginning of the universe. Is there a parallel to Darwin here?
One possibility is that it is just luck. I mean, it's certainly possible that the universe is a one-shot universe that came into being, and it came into being with the current mix of fundamental constants, strengths of the forces. That's a possibility. We don't know whether that's true or not. But it's a feasible explanation. Another possibility is that this is not the only universe. This is one of myriads of universes. That there are billions and billions of universes, that they perhaps are still coming into existence. It could be that this universe is spawning billions of universes as we sit here talking. And all these universes are perhaps different, with different mixes of fundamental constants. And it's just some of them, not necessarily one, but in fact this one, as an example, that happen among all those almost infinite number of universes to have the right mix.
So we have two explanations of the order in the universe: the many universes hypothesis, or the hypothesis of God the designer. Which of these two explanations should we accept? Which of them is the best explanation? Well, philosophers and scientists agree that the best explanation is the one which matches three criteria. The first criterion is that any hypothesis should lead us to expect the evidence we can see. Secondly, if the hypothesis weren't true, then we shouldn't expect to see the same evidence. The third criterion is that the hypothesis must be the simplest available. Let's take the first two criteria. How does the many universes hypothesis hold up against testable evidence?
It's an idea that's been put forward by several scientists. That doesn't, in fact, make it a scientific explanation, which doesn't, of course, mean it's necessarily untrue, but it's not science. Also, it's not science in the sense that you can never prove it, because other universes, by definition, cannot be reached from this universe. If they could, they'd be part of this universe. They can't be reached. So you can never verify it. So on those grounds, it's not science. It has to be a matter of faith. So whether you have faith in an infinite number of universes or faith in God, it comes down to faith.
Now, we have to be very careful about what we mean by testable. Religion effectively throws away the criterion of test. It's not a part of the canon of belief. It doesn't matter whether the evidence is for or against your belief. Your belief is stronger than any evidence that might be presented. So religion, to me, is totally anti-intellectual.
I'm fairly happy to live with "I don't know" as the answer to many questions. I don't feel forced to have an answer. And so I'm quite happy to sit light as our understanding grows, as our data comes in, and to gradually formulate the answers. I don't require an answer, just like that.
So neither view is directly testable. The most we can say is that the scientific view may be testable in the future, or science may come up with another view which is testable. But what about the third criterion, the criterion that said the best explanation is the simplest one available?
If you toss a coin an infinite number of times, you're going to have some of these times in which there are an enormous number of heads, which you wouldn't otherwise expect. So the suggestion is we can explain the characteristics of our world by supposing there are an infinite number of worlds and they all have different characteristics, so it's not surprising that one of them has our sort of characteristics. Well now, this seems quite an extraordinarily complicated hypothesis. You are postulating the existence of an infinite number of worlds in order to explain one world. I am postulating one further entity, God, in order to explain our world. the comparison seems just dauntingly different. An infinite number of worlds. We have absolutely no other reason for supposing there are an infinite number of worlds except to explain the existence of ours. All the rules indicate you mustn't postulate more entities than are necessary to explain the phenomena.
I've not heard any explanation from anyone religious, because it's always been an explanation of the form that I hereby pass the buck. Because they say, well, it was designed. Someone sat down somewhere, out of time, out of space, designed it all, and then implemented it. Now that seems to me to be, at the same time as being a very lazy explanation, because it is passing the buck. It's also a non-explanation, because it doesn't actually say what happened.
So again, the answer isn't clear. You could argue that the many worlds hypothesis isn't the simplest explanation, but you could also argue that invoking God doesn't give us any explanation at all. Let's leave this for the moment and go back to the question we started with. How do we explain the apparently unlikely set of circumstances that led to the creation of life? The plausibility of the argument from design rests on the claim that the order in the universe is very unlikely unless there's a God. And this is the claim that is being denied. And the thought goes something like this. You might think it's surprising that the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. But it had to be something, so why not that? And similarly, it might look unlikely that the universe was such as to produce life. But it had to produce something, so why not that? The very fact that we're here at all means that however unlikely, the universe did in fact create life.
Imagine that there's a man that's about to be executed. He's in front of the firing squad, and there are 10 marksmen. None of them have ever missed their target. But on this occasion, for some reason, all 10 miss. And the convict is afterwards interviewed by the media, and they say, isn't it, how do you react to this extraordinary coincidence that they all missed? He said, there's nothing extraordinary about it. If they hadn't missed, I wouldn't be here talking to you. One feels that the convict hasn't quite understood what the problem is.
If the survival of the convict needs an explanation, then surely the creation of life in the universe also needs explaining.
That kind of reasoning turns upon the assumption that the universe was somehow free to have a wider range of laws of physics than it has. Since we don't understand why the laws of physics are the way they are, it seems to us reasonable to say, well, they could have been different. And out of all the range of values which they could have had, only this one gives rise to stars and large atoms to make the elements, etc. But of course, it's a big assumption to assume that the laws of physics could have been different. It could be that when we understand more, we'll see that there was only one way that they could have been, for a priori reasons which came before, nothing to do with sort of aiming at the final goal of producing life.
So it might be that there's no question that needs answering here at all. If probability is governed by the laws of nature, then there's just no sense in asking about the probability of the laws of nature themselves. Probability always requires a certain background, and as we know, there was no background before the laws of nature came into being. We've only come a very little way in answering the questions thrown up by the argument from design. If God is the explanation of order, we're still left with the questions of what kind of God, whether there is one God or many, and who or what is the explanation of God. These are characteristically philosophical questions, the sort of questions we ask if we want to find reasons for our beliefs. And we ask them because usually we like to think our beliefs are reasonable or rational. However, some argue that religious belief is different, that when it comes to God, you shouldn't necessarily look for reason and argument. Rather, you ought simply to have faith. To have faith that something is true, you don't need argument, you need inner conviction.
I believe in a God for two reasons. I must say, as a teenager, I started looking for a proof of the existence of God. Maybe every teenager does. And of course, I didn't find it. And I fairly quickly realized that maybe there is no proof in the existence of God. So I adopted as a working hypothesis, here's the scientist at work, as a working hypothesis, a belief in the existence of God, and decided to explore where that took me. And whilst it hasn't taken me anywhere where there's a proof, it's taken me quite a long way along that road, and I don't think now I would want to abandon that hypothesis. My very strong sense of the presence of God comes in two ways. One is mediated through people, and the other is through the very gathered Quaker meeting for worship, which can, doesn't always, frequently doesn't, but can become very intensely still, with everybody present sensing something extra, something further. The phrase they used to give for this in the sort of 1600s was the meeting was covered with a sense of the presence of God. And that's my main reasons for believing in the existence of God, those two kinds of experience.
Faith is a central tenet of many religions. Millions of people the world over feel they have a personal acquaintance with God. To them, faith is as real as any proof or evidence. So why are science and philosophy opposed to using faith as an alternative to argument? What's wrong with faith?
Laziness. I mean, it's a cop-out. It fails to use the information that we are gathering scientifically. It fails to use the power of rational argument to deduce from all that we see around us a plausible explanation. It's simple intellectual laziness. And of course, the other flaw is that it pushes the question back to whom made God.
I think the problem is that there's an infinite number of beliefs which could be based on faith. So if somebody says, I simply have faith that X is the case, and you can't deny me the right to have that faith, I would have to accept that, but then I could say, well, I have faith that there's a teapot in orbit round the planet Pluto, and there's nothing you can say that will dissuade me from it. I have faith that there are fairies at the bottom of my garden. When there's an infinite number of beliefs that you could hold as a consequence of a certain kind of justification, I think that rather undermines the validity of that kind of justification. If you have a rational scientific explanation for some process, I mean, suppose you wanted to know why rivers flow downhill and why they meander the way they do, and a tribal witch doctor believes that there's a spirit of the river, a river sprite or something, which actually guides the river downstream, and you explain the physics to him and the fluid dynamics, and he says, yes, well, I understand all that, it's a very good theory, but I expect there's a river sprite as well. doing it at the same time. It's superfluous. We can't prove there aren't river sprites, but if there are, they're not doing anything more than what the physics is doing anyway, so they might just as well not be there. It's the same thing with God and the universe.
We have looked at just one argument for the existence of God, the argument from design. And whether you are religious or not, I hope you'll have seen that philosophy can be used to structure the arguments so that we can see clearly who is asserting what and who's denying what. And this took us to the broader issue of the relation between philosophy and faith. And if you're the kind of person who wants your religious beliefs to be solidly grounded in reason and argument, then proofs of the existence of God will be the kind of thing that you're interested in. On the other hand, if you feel that your religious beliefs can be grounded in faith and conviction, then that kind of thing just won't bother you so much.
I have worried long and long about whether God created the universe in any literal sense. But I've also found that you can be torn apart by that kind of academic question and then, at least for me, go into a Quaker meeting for worship, which is incredibly still and intense and can have a very strong, lively sense of the presence of God. And in that kind of environment, those academic questions go out the window, 100 miles away. They're just not important. For me, the most important thing is the sense of the presence of God that I have at times. Not there all the time, unfortunately, but at least some of the time. And whilst I hold on to that as the core, then around that I try and construct a rational faith belief system that is consistent with my science. And I don't have great difficulty doing that.
I'm sorry to say, I think it's awfully easy to hallucinate, and the human brain is extremely good at making things up. When you look up in the clouds and you see faces, when you look at the surface features of the planet Mars through a telescope and think you see canals or even think you see a face, the human brain is extremely good at conjuring up things which are not there. If the brain can do that, how much more easily can the brain believe that it has a personal acquaintanceship with God? To a brain with as sophisticated a power of simulation, if I could put it in computer language, as ours has, it's a doddle to make still small voices, to make the illusion of personal acquaintance. I'm not impressed.
Here's a look at what's coming up in business on BBC Learning.